Chapter 20, Part 2 of The Teeth of the Tiger. This LibriVox is in the public domain. The Teeth of the Tiger, by Maurice Leblanc. Chapter 20. Florence's Secret. Then Don Luis Perenna, holding the other end of the lasso, came up to him and bound him hand and foot with what remained of the rope. The operation was carefully performed. Don Luis repeated it time after time, using the coils of rope which the cripple had brought to the well, and gagging him with a handkerchief. And while applying himself to his work, he explained with affected politeness, "You see, sir, people always come to grief through excessive self-confidence. They never imagine that their adversaries can have resources which they themselves do not possess. For instance, when you got me to fall into your trap, how could you have supposed, my dear sir, that a man like myself, a man like Arsène Lupin, hanging on the brim of a well, with his arms resting on the brim and his feet against the inner wall, would allow himself to drop down it like the first silly fool that comes along? Look here, you were 15 or 20 yards away, and do you think that I had not the strength to leap out, nor the courage to face the bullets of your revolver, when it was a question of saving Florence Levasseur's life and my own? Why, my poor sir, the tiniest effort would have been enough, believe me. My reason for not making the effort was that I had something better to do, something infinitely better. I will tell you why. That is, if you care to know. Do you? Well, then, at the very first moment, my knees and feet, propped against the inner wall, had smashed in a thick layer of plaster which closed up an old excavation in the well, and this I at once perceived. It was a stroke of luck, wasn't it? And it changed the whole situation. My plan was settled at once. While I went on acting my little part of the gentleman about to tumble down an abyss, putting on the most scared face, the most staring eyes, the most hideous grin, I enlarged that excavation, taking care to throw the chunks of plaster in front of me in such a way that their fall made no noise. When the moment came, at the very second when my swooning features vanished before your eyes, I simply jumped into my retreat, thanks to a rather plucky little wriggle of the loins. I was saved because the retreat was dug out on the side where you were moving, and because, being dark itself, it cast no light. All that I now had to do was to wait. I listened quietly to your threatening speeches. I let the things you flung down the well go past me. And when I thought you had gone back to Florence, I was preparing to leave my refuge, to return to the light of the day, and to fall upon you from behind, when—" Don Luis turned the cripple over, as though he were a parcel which he was tying up with string, and continued, "Have you ever been to Tancarville, the old feudal castle in Normandy, on the banks of the Seine? Haven't you? Well, you must know that, outside the ruins of the keep, there is an old well which, like many other wells of the period, possesses the peculiarity of having two openings, one at the top, facing the sky, and the other a little lower down, hollowed out sideways in the wall, and leading to one of the rooms of the keep. At Tancarville, this second opening is nowadays closed with a grating. Here it was walled up with a layer of small stones and plaster, and it was just the recollection of Tancarville that made me stay, all the more as there was no hurry, since you had had the kindness to inform me that Florence would not join me in the next world until 4 o'clock. I therefore inspected my refuge, and soon realized that, as I had already felt by intuition, it was the foundation of a building which was now demolished, and which had the garden laid out on its ruins. Well, I went on, groping my way and following the direction which, above ground, would have taken me to the grotto. My presentiments were not deceived. A gleam of daylight made its way at the top of a staircase of which I had struck the bottom step. I went up it and heard the sound of your voice." Don Luis turned the cripple over, and was pretty rough about it. Then he resumed, "I wish to impress upon you, my dear sir, that the upshot would have been exactly similar if I had attacked you directly and from the start in the open air. But, having said this, I confess that chance favoured me to some purpose. It has often failed me in the course of our struggle, but this time I had no cause to complain. I felt myself in such luck that I never doubted for a second that, having found the entrance to the subterranean passage, I should also find the way out. As a matter of fact, I had only to pull gently at the slight obstacle of a few stacked bricks which hid the opening in order to make my exit amid the remains of the castle keep. Guided by the sound of your voice, I slipped through the stones and thus reached the back of the grotto in which Florence lay. Amusing, wasn't it? You can imagine what fun it was to hear you make your little speeches.
Answer me, yes or no, Florence. A movement of your head will decide your fate. If it's yes, I shall release you. If it's no, you die. Answer me, Florence. A sign of your head. Is the answer yes or no?"
And the end, above all, was delicious, when you scrambled to the top of the grotto and started roaring from up there.
"It's you who have asked to die, Florence. You asked for it, and you've got it."
Just think what a joke it was. At that moment there was no one in the grotto. Not a soul. With one effort I had drawn Florence toward me and put her under shelter. And all that you were able to crush with your avalanche of rocks was one or two spiders, perhaps, and a few flies dozing on the flagstones. The trick was done, and the farce was nearly finished. Act first, Arsène Lupin saved. Act second, Florence Levasseur saved. Act third and last, the monster vanquished, absolutely and with a vengeance. Don Luis stood up and contemplated his work with a satisfied eye. "You look like a sausage, my son," he cried, yielding at last to his sarcastic nature and his habit of treating his enemies familiarly. "A regular sausage, a bit on the thin side, perhaps, a Savoy for poor people. But there, you don't much care what you look like, I suppose? Besides, you're rather like that at all times. And in any case, you're just the thing for the little display of indoor gymnastics which I have in mind for you. You'll see, it's an idea of my own, a really original idea. Don't be impatient, we shan't be long." He took one of the guns which the cripple had brought to the well, and tied to the middle of the gun the end of a 12 or 15 yards length of rope, fastening the other end to the cords with which the cripple was bound, just behind his back. He next took his captive round the body and held him over the well. "Shut your eyes if you feel at all giddy, and don't be frightened, I'll be very careful. Ready?" He put the cripple down the yawning hole and next took hold of the rope which he had just fastened. Then, little by little, inch by inch, cautiously, so that it should not knock against the sides of the well, the bundle was let down at arm's length. When it reached a depth of 12 yards or so, the gun stopped its further descent, and there it remained, slung in the dark and in the exact centre of the narrow circumference. Don Luis set light to a number of pieces of paper which went whirling down, shedding their sinister gleams upon the walls. Then, unable to resist the craving for a last speech, he leaned over, as the scoundrel had done, and grinned. "I selected the place with care, so that you shouldn't catch cold. I'm bound to look after you, you see. I promised Florence that I wouldn't kill you, and I promised the French government to hand you over alive as soon as possible. Only, as I didn't know what to do with you until tomorrow morning, I've hung you up in the air. It's a pretty trick, isn't it? And you ought to appreciate it, for it's so like your own way of doing things. Just think, the gun is resting on its two ends, with hardly an inch to spare. So if you start wriggling or moving, or even breathing too hard, either the barrel or the butt end will give way, and down you go. As for me, I've nothing to do with it. If you die, it'll be a pretty little case of suicide. All you've got to do, old chap, is to keep quiet. And the beauty of my little contrivance is that it will give you a foretaste of the few nights that will precede your last hour, when they cut off your head. From this moment forward you are alone with your conscience, face to face with what you perhaps call your soul, without anything to disturb your silent soliloquy. It's nice and thoughtful of me, isn't it? Well, I'll leave you, and remember, not a movement, not a sigh, not a wink, not a throb of the heart, and above all, no larks. If you start larking, you're in the soup. Meditate, that's the best thing you can do. Meditate and wait. Goodbye for the present." And Don Luis, satisfied with his homily, went off muttering, "That's all right. I won't go so far as Eugène Sue, who says that great criminals should have their eyes put out. But all the same, a little corporal punishment, nicely seasoned with fear, is right and proper and good for the health and morals." Don Luis walked away, and taking the brick path round the ruins, turned down a little road, which ran along the outer wall to a clump of fir trees, where he had brought Florence for shelter. She was waiting for him, still aching from the horrible suffering which she had endured, but already in full possession of her pluck, mistress of herself, and apparently rid of all anxiety as to the issue of the fight between Don Luis and the cripple. "It's finished," he said simply. "Tomorrow I will hand him over to the police." She shuddered, but she did not speak, and he observed her in silence. It was the first time that they were alone together since they had been separated by so many tragedies, and next hurled against each other like sworn enemies. Don Luis was so greatly excited that, in the end, he could utter only insignificant sentences, having no connection with the thoughts that came rushing through his mind. "We shall find the motor car if we follow this wall and then strike off to the left. Do you think you can manage to walk so far? When we're in the car, we'll go to Alençon. There's a quiet hotel close to the chief square. You can wait there until things take a more favourable turn for you, and that won't be long, as the criminal is caught." "Let's go," she said. He dared not offer to help her. For that matter, she stepped out firmly, and her graceful body swung from her hips with the same even rhythm as usual. Don Luis once again felt all his old admiration and all his ardent love for her. And yet that had never seemed more remote than at this moment when he had saved her life by untold miracles of energy. She had not vouchsafed him a word of thanks, nor yet one of those milder glances which reward an effort made. And she remained the same as on the first day, the mysterious creature whose secret soul he had never understood, and upon whom not even the storm of terrible events had cast the faintest light. What were her thoughts? What were her wishes? What aim was she pursuing? These were obscure problems which he could no longer hope to solve. Henceforth each of them must go his own way in life, and each of them could only remember the other with feelings of anger and spite. "No," he said to himself, as she took her place in the limousine. "No, the separation shall not take place like that. The words that have to be spoken between us shall be spoken, and whether she wishes or not, I will tear the veil that hides her." The journey did not take long. At Alençon, Don Luis entered Florence in the visitor's book under the first name that occurred to him, and left her to herself. An hour later he came and knocked at her door. This time again he had not the courage at once to ask her the question which he had made up his mind to put to her. Besides, there were other points which he wished to clear up. "Florence," he said, "before I hand over that man, I should like to know what he was to you." "A friend, an unhappy friend, for whom I felt pity," she declared. "I find it difficult to-day to understand my compassion for such a monster, but some years ago, when I first met him, I became attached to him because of his wretchedness, his physical weakness, and all the symptoms of death which he bore upon him even then. He had the opportunity of doing me a few services, and though he led a hidden life, which worried me in certain respects, he gradually, and without my knowing it, acquired a considerable influence over me. I believed in his insight, in his will, in his absolute devotion, and when the Mornington case started, it was he, as I now realize, who guided my actions, and later, those of Gaston Sauverand. It was he who compelled me to practice lying and deceit, persuading me that he was working for Marie Fauville's safety. It was he who inspired us with such suspicion of yourself, and who taught us to be so silent, where he and his affairs were concerned, that Gaston Sauverand did not even dare mention him in his interview with you. I don't know how I can have been so blind, but it was so. Nothing opened my eyes, nothing made me suspect for a moment that harmless ailing creature, who spent half his life in hospitals or nursing homes, who underwent every possible sort of operation, and who, if he did sometimes speak to me of his love, must have known that he could not hope to—" Florence did not finish her sentence. Her eyes had encountered Don Luis's eyes, and she received a deep impression that he was not listening to what she said. He was looking at her, and that was all. The words she uttered passed unheard. To Don Luis any explanation concerning the tragedy itself mattered nothing, so long as he was not enlightened on the one point that interested him, on Florence's private thoughts about himself, thoughts of aversion, of contempt. Outside that, anything that she could say was vain and tedious. He went up to her and, in a low voice, said, "Florence, you know what I feel for you, do you not?" She blushed, taken aback, as though the question was the very last that she expected to hear. Nevertheless, she did not lower her eyes, and she answered frankly, "Yes, I know." "But perhaps," he continued more eagerly, "you do not know how deeply I feel it. Perhaps you do not know that my life has no other aim but you." "I know that also," she said. "Then, if you know it," he said, "I must conclude that it was just that which caused your hostility to me. From the beginning I tried to be your friend, and I tried only to defend you. And yet from the beginning I felt that for you I was the object of an aversion that was both instinctive and deliberate. Never did I see in your eyes anything but coldness, dislike, contempt, and even repulsion. At moments of danger, when your life or your liberty was at stake, you risked committing any imprudence rather than accept my assistance. I was the enemy, the man to be distrusted, the man capable of every infamy, the man to be avoided and to be thought of only with a sort of dread. Isn't that hatred? Is there anything but hatred to explain such an attitude?" Florence did not answer at once. She seemed to be putting off the moment at which to speak the words that rose to her lips. Her face, thin and drawn with weariness and pain, was gentler than usual. "Yes," she said, "there are other things than hatred to explain that attitude." Don Luis was dumbfounded. He did not quite understand the meaning of the reply. But Florence's tone of voice disconcerted him beyond measure, and he also saw that Florence's eyes no longer wore their usual scornful expression, and that they were filled with smiling charm. And it was the first time that Florence had smiled in his presence. "Speak, speak, I entreat you," he stammered. "I mean to say that there is another feeling which explains coldness, mistrust, fear, and hostility. It is not always those whom we detest that we avoid with the greatest fear. And if we avoid them, it is often because we are afraid of ourselves, because we are ashamed, because we rebel and want to resist and want to forget and cannot." She stopped, and when he wildly stretched out his arms to her, as if beseeching her to say more and still more, she nodded her head, thus telling him that she need not go on speaking for him to read to the very bottom of her soul and discover the secret of love which she kept hidden there. Don Luis staggered on his feet. He was intoxicated with happiness, almost suffered physical pain from that unexpected happiness. After the horrible minutes through which he had passed amid the impressive surroundings of the old castle, it appeared to him madness to admit that such extraordinary bliss could suddenly blossom forth in the commonplace setting of that room at a hotel. He could have longed for space around him, forest, mountains, moonlight, a radiant sunset, all the beauty and all the poetry of the earth. With one rush he had reached the very acme of happiness. Florence's very life came before him, from the instant of their meeting to the tragic moment when the cripple, bending over her and seeing her eyes filled with tears, had shouted, "She's crying, she's crying! What madness! But I know your secret, Florence, and you're crying. Florence, Florence, you yourself want to die." It was a secret of love, a passionate impulse which from the first day had driven her all trembling toward Don Luis. Then it had bewildered her, filled her with fear, appeared to her as a betrayal of Marie and Sauverand, and by turns urging her toward and drawing her away from the man whom she loved and whom she admired for his heroism and loyalty, rending her with remorse and overwhelming her as though it were a crime, had ended by delivering her, feeble and disabled, to the diabolical influence of the villain who coveted her. Don Luis did not know what to do, did not know in what words to express his rapture. His lips trembled, his eyes filled with tears. His nature prompted him to take her in his arms, to kiss her as a child kisses, full on the lips, with a full heart. But a feeling of intense respect paralyzed his yearning, and, overcome with emotion, he fell at Florence's feet, stammering words of love and adoration. Chapter 21 of The Teeth of the Tiger. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. The Teeth of the Tiger, by Maurice Leblanc. Chapter 21. Lupin's Lupins. Next morning, a little before 8 o'clock, Valenglay was talking in his own flat to the Prefect of Police, and asked, "So you think as I do, my dear Prefect, he'll come?" "I haven't the least doubt of it, Monsieur le Président, and he will come with the same punctuality that has been shown throughout this business. He will come, for pride's sake, at the last stroke of 8. "You think so?" "Monsieur le Président, I have been studying the man for months. As things now stand, with Florence Levasseur's life in the balance, if he has not smashed the villain whom he is hunting down, if he does not bring him back bound hand and foot, it will mean that Florence Levasseur is dead, and that he, Arsène Lupin, is dead." "Whereas Lupin is immortal," said Valenglay, laughing. "You're right. Besides, I agree with you entirely. No one would be more astonished than I if our good friend was not here to the minute. You say you were rung up from Angers yesterday?" "Yes, Monsieur le Président. My men had just seen Don Luis Perenna. He had gone in front of them in an aeroplane." After that they telephoned to me again from Le Mans, where they had been searching a deserted coach-house. You may be sure that the search had already been made by Lupin, and that we shall know the results. Listen, 8 o'clock. At the same moment they heard the throbbing of a motor car. It stopped outside the house, and the bell rang almost immediately after. Orders had been given beforehand. The door opened, and Don Luis Perenna was shown in. To Valenglay and the Prefect of Police, his arrival was certainly not unexpected, for they had just been saying that they would have been surprised if he had not come. Nevertheless, their attitude showed that astonishment which we all experience in the face of events that seem to pass the bounds of human possibility. "Well?" cried the Prime Minister eagerly. "It's done, Monsieur le Président." "Have you collared the scoundrel?" "Yes." "By Jove!" said Valenglay, "you're a fine fellow." And he went on to ask, "An ogre, of course, an evil, undaunted brute?" "No, Monsieur le Président, a cripple, a degenerate, responsible for his actions certainly, but a man in whom the doctors will find every form of wasting illness, disease of the spinal cord, tuberculosis, and all the rest of it." "And is that the man whom Florence Levasseur loved?" "Monsieur le Président!" Don Luis violently protested. "Florence never loved that wretch. She felt sorry for him, as any one would do for a fellow creature doomed to an early death. And it was out of pity that she allowed him to hope that she might marry him later, at some time in the vague future." "Are you sure of that?" "Yes, Monsieur le Président, of that and of a good deal more besides, for I have the proofs in my hands." Without further preamble, he continued, "Monsieur le Président, now that the man is caught, it will be easy for the police to find out every detail of his life. But meanwhile I can sum up that monstrous life for you, looking only at the criminal side of it and passing briefly over 3 murders which have nothing to do with the story of the Mornington case. Jean Vernoc was born at Alençon and brought up at old M. Langernault's expense. He got to know the de Dessus-la-Mer couple, robbed them of their money, and, before they had time to lodge a complaint against the unknown thief, took them to a barn in the village of Damigny, where in their despair, stupefied and besotted with drugs, they hanged themselves. This barn stood in a property called the Old Castle, belonging to M. Langernault, Jean Vernoc's protector, who was ill at the time. After his recovery, as he was cleaning his gun, he received a full charge of shot in the abdomen. The gun had been loaded without the old fellow's knowledge. By whom? By Jean Vernoc, who had also emptied his patron's cash-box the night before. In Paris, where he went to enjoy the little fortune which he had thus amassed, Jean Vernoc bought from some rogue of his acquaintance papers containing evidence of Florence Levasseur's birth and of her right to all the inheritance of the Roussel family and Victor Sauverand, papers which the friend in question had purloined from the old nurse who brought Florence over from America. By hunting around, Jean Vernoc ended by discovering first a photograph of Florence, and then Florence herself. He made himself useful to her and pretended to be devoted to her, giving up his whole life to her service. At that time he did not yet know what profit he could derive from the papers stolen from the girl or from his relations with her. Suddenly everything became different. An indiscreet word let fall by a solicitor's clerk told him of a will in Maître Lepertuis's drawer which would be interesting to look at. He obtained a sight of it by bribing the clerk, who has since disappeared, with a 1,000-franc note. The will, as it happened, was Cosmo Mornington's, and in it Cosmo Mornington bequeathed his immense wealth to the heirs of the Roussel sisters and of Victor Sauverand. Jean Vernoc saw his chance. 100 million francs, to get hold of that sum, to obtain riches, luxury, power, and the means of buying health and strength from the world's great healers. All that he had to do was first to put away the different persons who stood between the inheritance and Florence, and then, when all the obstacles were overcome, to make Florence his wife. Jean Vernoc went to work. He had found among the papers of Hippolyte Fauville's old friend Langernault particulars relating to the Roussel family and to the discord that reigned in the Fauville household. 5 persons, all told, were in his way. First, of course, Cosmo Mornington; next, in the order of their claims, Hippolyte Fauville, his son Edmond, his wife Marie, and his cousin Gaston Sauverand. With Cosmo Mornington the thing was easy enough. Introducing himself to the American as a doctor, Jean Vernoc put poison into one of the phials which Mornington used for his hypodermic injections. But in the case of Hippolyte Fauville, whose goodwill he had secured through his acquaintance with old Langernault, and over whose mind he soon obtained an extraordinary influence, he had a greater difficulty to contend with. Knowing on the one hand that the engineer hated his wife, and on the other that he was stricken with a fatal disease, he took occasion, after the consultation with the specialist in London, to suggest to Fauville's terrified brain the incredible plan of suicide, of which you were subsequently able to trace the Machiavellian execution. In this way, and with a single effort, anonymously, so to speak, and without appearing in the business, without Fauville's even suspecting the action brought to bear upon him, Jean Vernoc procured the deaths of Fauville and his son, and got rid of Marie and Sauverand by the devilish expedient of causing the charge of murder, of which no one could accuse him, to fall upon them. The plan succeeded. There was only one hitch at the present time: the intervention of Inspector Vérot. Inspector Vérot died; and there was only one danger in the future: the intervention of myself, Don Luis Perenna, whose conduct Vernoc was bound to foresee, as I was the residuary legatee by the terms of Cosmo Mornington's will. This danger Vernoc tried to avert first by giving me the house on the Place du Palais Bourbon to live in, and Florence Levasseur as a secretary, and next by making 4 attempts to have me assassinated by Gaston Sauverand. He therefore held all the threads of the tragedy in his hands. Able to come and go as he pleased in my house, enforcing himself upon Florence and later upon Gaston Sauverand by the strength of his will and the cunning of his character, he was within sight of the goal. When my efforts succeeded in proving the innocence of Marie Fauville and Gaston Sauverand, he did not hesitate. Marie Fauville died. Gaston Sauverand died. So everything was going well for him. The police pursued me. The police pursued Florence. No one suspected him. And the date fixed for the payment of the inheritance was at hand. This was 2 days ago. At that time, Jean Vernoc was in the midst of the fray. He was ill and had obtained admission to the nursing home in the Avenue des Ternes. From there he conducted his operations, thanks to his influence over Florence Levasseur and to the letters addressed to the Mother Superior from Versailles. Acting under the Superior's orders, and ignorant of the meaning of the step which she was taking, Florence went to the meeting at the Prefect's office, and herself brought the documents relating to her. Meanwhile Jean Vernoc left the private hospital and took refuge near the Ile Saint-Louis, where he awaited the result of an enterprise which, at the worst, might tell against Florence, but which did not seem able to compromise him in any case. "You know the rest, Monsieur le Président," said Don Luis, concluding his statement. Florence, staggered by the sudden revelation of the part which she had unconsciously taken in the matter, and especially by the terrible part played by Jean Vernoc, ran away from the nursing home where the Prefect had brought her at my request. She had but one thought: to see Jean Vernoc, demand an explanation of him, and hear what he had to say in his defence. That same evening he carried her away by motor, on the pretence of giving her proofs of his innocence. That is all, Monsieur le Président." Valenglay had listened with growing interest to this gruesome story of the most malevolent genius conceivable to the mind of man; and he heard it perhaps without too great disgust, because of the light which it threw by contrast upon the bright, easy, happy, and spontaneous genius of the man who had fought for the good cause. "And you found them?" he asked. "At 3 o'clock yesterday afternoon, Monsieur le Président. It was time. I might even say that it was too late, for Jean Vernoc began by sending me to the bottom of a well, and by crushing Florence under a block of stone." "Oh, so you're dead, are you?" "Yes, Monsieur le Président." "But why did that villain want to do away with Florence Levasseur? Her death destroyed his indispensable scheme of matrimony." "It takes 2 to get married, Monsieur le Président, and Florence refused." "Well?" "Some time ago, Jean Vernoc wrote a letter leaving all that he possessed to Florence Levasseur. Florence, moved by pity for him, and not realizing the importance of what she was doing, wrote a similar letter leaving her property to him. This letter constitutes a genuine and indisputable will in favour of Jean Vernoc. As Florence was Cosmo Mornington's legal and settled heiress by the mere fact of her presence at yesterday's meeting, with the documents proving her descent from the Roussel family, her death caused her rights to pass to her own legal and settled heir. Jean Vernoc would have come into the money without the possibility of any litigation, and as you would have been obliged to discharge him after his arrest, for lack of evidence against him, he would have led a quiet life, with 14 murders on his conscience, I have added them up, but with 100 million francs in his pocket. To a monster of his stamp, the one made up for the other. "But do you possess all the proofs?" asked Valenglay eagerly. "Here they are," said Perenna, producing the pocket book which he had taken out of the cripple's jacket. "Here are letters and documents which the villain preserved, owing to a mental aberration common to all great criminals. Here, by good luck, is his correspondence with Hippolyte Fauville. Here is the original of the prospectus from which I learned that the house on the Place du Palais Bourbon was for sale. Here is a memorandum of Jean Vernocq's journeys to Alençon to intercept Fauville's letters to old Langernault. Here is another memorandum showing that Inspector Vérot overheard a conversation between Fauville and his accomplice, that he shadowed Vernoq and robbed him of Florence Levasseur's photograph, and that Vernoq sent Fauville in pursuit of him. Here is a third memorandum, which is just a copy of the two found in the 8th volume of Shakespeare, and which proves that Jean Vernoq, to whom that set of Shakespeare belonged, knew all about Fauville's machination. Here are his correspondence with Caceres, the Peruvian attaché, and the letters denouncing myself and Sergeant Mazeroux, which he intended to send to the press. Here... But need I say more, Monsieur le Président? You have the complete evidence in your hands. The magistrates will find that all the accusations which I made yesterday before the Prefect of Police were strictly true." "And he?" cried Valenglay. "The criminal? Where is he?" "Outside, in his motor car, rather." "Have you told my men?" asked M. Desmalions anxiously. "Yes, Monsieur le Préfet. Besides, the fellow is carefully tied up. Don't be alarmed. He won't escape." "Well, you've foreseen every contingency," said Valenglay, "and the business seems to me to be finished. But there's one problem that remains unexplained, the one perhaps that interested the public most. I mean the marks of the teeth in the apple, the teeth of the tiger, as they have been called, which were certainly Madame Fauville's teeth, innocent though she was. Monsieur le Préfet declares that you have solved this problem." "Yes, Monsieur le Président, and Jean Vernocq's papers prove that I was right. Besides, the problem is quite simple. The apple was marked with Madame Fauville's teeth, but Madame Fauville never bit the apple." Come. Monsieur le Président, Hippolyte Fauville very nearly said as much when he mentioned this mystery in his posthumous confession." "Hippolyte Fauville was a madman." "Yes, but a lucid madman, and capable of reasoning with the most appalling logic. Some years ago, at Palermo, Madame Fauville had a very bad fall, hitting her mouth against the marble top of a table, with the result that a number of her teeth, in both the upper and the lower jaw, were loosened. To repair the damage, and to make the gold plate intended to strengthen the teeth, a plate which Madame Fauville wore for several months, the dentist, as usual, took an impression of her mouth. M. Fauville happened to have kept the mould, and he used it to print the marks of his wife's teeth in the cake of chocolate shortly before his death, and in the apple on the night of his death. When this was done, he put the mould with the other things which the explosion was meant to, and did, destroy." Don Luis's explanation was followed by a silence. The thing was so simple that the Prime Minister was quite astonished. The whole tragedy, the whole charge, everything that had caused Marie's despair and death, and the death of Gaston Sauverand, all this rested on an infinitely small detail which had occurred to none of the millions and millions of people who had interested themselves so enthusiastically in the mystery of the teeth of the tiger. The teeth of the tiger! Everybody had clung stubbornly to an apparently invincible argument. As the marks on the apple and the print of Madame Fauville's teeth were identical, as no two persons in the world were able, in theory or practice, to produce the same print with their teeth, Madame Fauville must needs be guilty. Nay, more, the argument seemed so absolute that, from the day on which Madame Fauville's innocence became known, the problem had remained unsolved, while no one seemed capable of conceiving the one paltry idea, that it was possible to obtain the print of a tooth in another way than by a live bite of that same tooth. "It's like the egg of Columbus," said Valenglay, laughing. "It had to be thought of." "You are right, Monsieur le Président. People don't think of those things. Here is another instance. May I remind you that during the period when Arsène Lupin was known at the same time as Monsieur Lenormand and as Prince Paul Sernine, no one noticed that the name Paul Sernine was merely an anagram of Arsène Lupin? Well, it's just the same today. Luis Perenna also is an anagram of Arsène Lupin. The two names are composed of the same 11 letters, neither more nor less. And yet, although it was the second time, nobody thought of making that little comparison. The egg of Columbus again. It had to be thought of." Valenglay was a little surprised at the revelation. It seemed as if that devil of a man had sworn to puzzle him up to the last moment, and to bewilder him by the most unexpected sensational news. And how well this last detail depicted the fellow, a queer mixture of dignity and impudence, of mischief and simplicity, of smiling chaff and disconcerting charm, a sort of hero who, while conquering kingdoms by most incredible adventures, amused himself by mixing up the letters on his name so as to catch the public napping. The interview was nearly at an end. Valenglay said to Perenna: "Monsieur, you have done wonders in this business, and ended by keeping your word and handing over the criminal. I also will keep my word. You are free." "I thank you, Monsieur le Président. But what about Sergeant Mazeroux?" "He will be released this morning. Monsieur le Préfet de Police has arranged matters so that the public do not know of the arrest of either of you. You are Don Luis Perenna. There is no reason why you should not remain Don Luis Perenna." "And Florence Levasseur, Monsieur le Président?" "Let her go before the examining magistrate of her own accord. He is bound to discharge her. Once free and acquitted of any charge, or even suspicion, she will certainly be recognized as Cosmo Mornington's legal heiress, and will receive the 100 millions. "She will not keep it, Monsieur le Président." "How do you mean?" "Florence Levasseur doesn't want the money. It has been the cause of unspeakable, awful crimes. She hates the very thought of it." "What then?" "Cosmo Mornington's 100 millions will be wholly devoted to making roads and building schools in the south of Morocco and the northern Congo." "In the Mauritanian Empire which you are giving us?" said Valenglay, laughing. "By Jove, it's a fine work, and I second it with all my heart. An empire with an imperial budget to keep it up with. Upon my word, Don Luis has behaved well to his country, and has handsomely paid the debts of Arsène Lupin." A month later, Don Luis Perenna and Mazeroux embarked in the yacht which had brought Don Luis to France. Florence was with them. Before sailing, they heard of the death of Jean Vernocq, who had managed to poison himself in spite of all the precautions taken to prevent him. On his arrival in Africa, Don Luis Perenna, Sultan of Mauritania, found his old associates and accredited Mazeroux to them and to his grand dignitaries. He organized the government to follow on his abdication, and precede the annexation of the new empire by France, and he had several secret interviews on the Moorish border with General Léauty, commanding the French troops, interviews in the course of which they thought out all the measures to be executed in succession so as to lend to the conquest of Morocco an appearance of facility which would otherwise be difficult to explain. The future was now assured. Soon the thin screen of rebellious tribes standing between the French and the pacified districts would fall to pieces, revealing an orderly empire, provided with a regular constitution, with good roads, schools, and courts of law, a flourishing empire in full working order. Then, when his task was done, Don Luis abdicated. He has now been back for over 2 years. Every one remembers the stir caused by his marriage with Florence Levasseur. The controversy was renewed, and many of the newspapers clamoured for Arsène Lupin's arrest. But what could the authorities do? Although nobody doubted who he really was, although the name of Arsène Lupin and the name of Don Luis Perenna consisted of the same letters, and people ended by remarking the coincidence, legally speaking, Arsène Lupin was dead and Don Luis Perenna was alive, and there was no possibility of bringing Arsène Lupin back to life, or of killing Don Luis Perenna. He is today living in the village of Saint-Maclou, among those charming valleys which run down to the Oise. Who does not know his modest little pink-washed house, with its green shutters and its garden filled with bright flowers? People make up parties to go there from Paris on Sundays, in a hope of catching a sight through the elder hedges of the man who was Arsène Lupin, or of meeting him in the village square. He is there, with his hair just touched with grey, his still youthful features, and a young man's bearing. And Florence is there, too, with her pretty figure and the halo of fair hair around her happy face, unclouded by even the shadow of an unpleasant recollection. Very often visitors come and knock at the little wooden gate. They are unfortunate people imploring the master's aid, victims of oppression, weaklings who have gone under in the struggle, reckless persons who have been ruined by their passions. For all these Don Luis is full of pity. He gives them his full attention, the help of his far-seeing advice, his experience, his strength, and even his time, disappearing for days and weeks to fight the good fight once more. And sometimes, also, it is an emissary from the prefect's office or some subordinate of the police who comes to submit a complex case to his judgment. Here again Don Luis applies the whole of his wonderful mind to the business. In addition to this, in addition to his old books on ethics and philosophy, to which he has returned with such pleasure, he cultivates his garden. He dotes on his flowers. He is proud of them. He takes prizes at the shows, and the success is still remembered of the treble carnation, streaked red and yellow, which he exhibited as the Arsène carnation. But he works hardest at certain large flowers that blossom in summer. During July and the first half of August they fill 2/3 of his lawn and all the borders of his kitchen garden. Beautiful, decorative plants, standing erect like flagstaffs, they proudly raise their spiky heads of all colours: blue, violet, mauve, pink, white. They are lupins, and include every variety: Cruikshank's lupin, the two-coloured lupin, the scented lupin, and the last to appear, Lupin's lupin. They are all there, resplendent, in serried ranks like an army of soldiers, each striving to outstrip the others, and to hold up the thickest and gaudiest spike to the sun. They are all there, and at the entrance to the walk that leads to their motley beds is a streamer with this device, taken from an exquisite sonnet of José Maria de Heredia: "And in my kitchen garden lupins grow." You will say that this is a confession. But why not? In the evening, when a few privileged neighbours meet at his house, the justice of the peace, the notary, Major Comte d'Astrignac, who has also gone to live at Saint Maclou, Don Luis is not afraid to speak of Arsène Lupin. "I used to see a great deal of him," he says. "He was not a bad man. I will not go so far as to compare him with the 7 sages, or even to hold him up as an example to future generations, but still we must judge him with a certain indulgence. He did a vast amount of good and a moderate amount of harm. Those who suffered through him deserved what they got, and fate would have punished them sooner or later if he had not forestalled her. Between a Lupin who selected his victims among the ruck of wicked rich men and some big company promoter who deliberately ruins numbers of poor people, would you hesitate for a moment? Does not Lupin come out best? And on the other hand, what a host of good actions! What countless proofs of disinterested generosity! A burglar? I admit it. A swindler? I don't deny it. He was all that. But he was something more than that. And while he amused the gallery with his skill and ingenuity, he roused the general enthusiasm in other ways. People laughed at his practical jokes, but they loved his pluck, his courage, his adventurous spirit, his contempt for danger, his shrewd insight, his unfailing good humour, his reckless energy, all qualities that stood out at a period when the most active virtues of our race had reached their zenith, the period of the motor car and the aeroplane. "One day," he said as a joke, "I should like my epitaph to read, 'Here lies Arsène Lupin, adventurer.'" That was quite correct. He was a master of adventure. And if the spirit of adventure led him too often to put his hand in other people's pockets, it also led him to battlefields, where it gives those who are worthy opportunity to fight and win titles of distinction which are not within reach of all. It was there that he gained his. It is there that you should see him at work, spending his strength braving death and defying destiny. And it is because of this that you must forgive him, even if he did sometimes get the better of a commissary of police, or steal the watch of an examining magistrate. Let us show some indulgence to our professors of energy." And nodding his head, Don Luis concludes: "Then, you see, he had another virtue which is not to be despised. It is a virtue for which we should be grateful to him in these grey days